I'm actually just off the road up Provo Canyon here, and if you can see behind this, there's a river, and right here, just off the river, kind of growing everywhere, is this horsetail.
All right, let's talk about some of my favorite organisms. Ferns, and I have horsetails, but really they're all part of this group. And right here you can see we've got some fern-related art, and we've got this fern-related clothing. And why is because in the 1800s, particularly around the time of this quote, there was this craze of people grabbing books and reading about ferns and learning about ferns and collecting ferns. And it's part of the reason why there is such a robust part of the horticulture industry that's comprised of ornamental ferns. That, and they can take low light and being watered heavily, which people who love plants love to water their plants. So often that's what kills people's pet plants, is that they overwater them. And there's a lot of these ferns that can really take that. But anyway, that's not what this lesson's about. But I just love this little quote here about people getting books and reading books about ferns passionately and voraciously. And I love this, and they're more active, more cheerful, and more self-forgetful over it being ferns than they would have been over novels or gossip, crochet, and Berlin wool. I love ferns. I have lots of different fern books. This is called the Fern Grower's Manual. And honestly, if you have an interest in ferns, particularly growing them, but there is lots of taxonomy in here as well. It's got beautiful illustrations. If any of y'all ever need any books, particularly as we move forward, or about fungi, I am obsessed with collecting books about things, and usually have a recommendation, but particularly this is sort of my go-to fern book. Okay, now we're in it with the ferns. Okay, and ferns have been part of our imagination for a very long time. Here we have this circle around the invisible flower and seed, this image here. Ferns are mysterious. They don't flower. They don't have seeds. And because of this, they seem to pop up anywhere and everywhere. And in horticulture, they're a weed in greenhouses because they show up in pots that you have no idea how those ferns got there, because at some stage of the development, a single spore or a group of spores ended up in that soil mixture or wherever. And so they're mysterious and they're exciting for those reasons. And I think we probably all read Where the Red Fern Grows. I'm not going to talk about it. You don't need to see me get choked up like that, but it's a classic. I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of fern ethnobotany as we get to different species, but as of right now, I'm gonna start going. So we've got the Manilophytes, these ferns and allies. It's over 12,000 species, a broad group that recently diverged. We can see that this is Jurassic period, but even many of them are even more recent than that. We've got eusporangiate ferns and leptosporangiate ferns, and we're going to talk about what those two mean. But these eusporangiate ferns are, we're going to talk about Psilotum and Equisetum. And then we'll obviously talk more about the leptosporangiate ferns. So here's some traits, okay, that are above all, and then we'll talk about those two categories. So they reproduce by spores that are held in sporangium. If you have a fern and you turn it over, say you've ever gotten an old school type of flower arrangement, and you see this fern that's in there, and it's going to have these little brown dots in little rows very uniformly underneath it like this. And these are sorus. They have sporangium inside them and spores, and that's how they reproduce. And then they've got these megaphylls that are complex leaves, branch veins, and have a fertile and infertile division. Now, will show you that sometimes these are adapted sort of like, they're not all exactly like this, but these are just some general traits. And the sporophyte generation is much more dominant, and fern gametophytes can reproduce on their own. And that's part of why they have this great biogeographic success. We'll talk about that. But here's a life cycle of one. And as they come up, I'm just going to go through them. And so we've got a single spore here. It germinates, and we have a young gametophyte. And this gametophyte sets these rhizoids to keep it in place. And on that gametophyte, we've got archegonium with an egg in it and an antheridium with a sperm. This should seem somewhat familiar from the lycopodium stuff. Okay, fertilization occurs, and then it's no longer an N, it's 2N. We have a zygote that has young sporophyll on the gametophyte, grows roots. A mature sporophyte grows, these sorus form with the sporangium and those first spores, etc. Okay, and so again, we've got the eusporangium, things like cylotum, and then the leptosporangium. And there's a few different cells. Okay, we've got these tapetum cells that are going to be the inner liner of this that spread out kind of horizontally to increase the size there. And this indusium we'll talk about, but what I would like to do is move to this slide so that we can see the difference between eusporangium and leptosporangium. Eusporangium are large, develops from many initial cells, and have those tapetum cells that form an inner wall, and they'll produce many spores. And here we have the eusporangium, and those are going to develop from a single initial cell, and there'll be an inner, outer cell. You can follow here, there's an apical cell. I'm not going to require you to be able to walk through this. These are the points I want you to understand. This will just help you visualize it, okay? And so these will, they also have a tapetum and those inner cells. But again, when it comes to this, I want you to know the two names and these two things. That their leptosporangia are small, develops from a single cell, produces small, definite number of cell spores. So a low number, a small number of spores. Okay, so here's some examples of eusporangiate ferns. We've got some whisk ferns here. We've got some horsetail type ferns here. And here's an example. This is Xylotaceae. Okay, this is a whisk fern. And these are, it's funny, they are widely cultivated as ornamentals, and then they show up a lot as a pest. In fact, many of these horsetails in your yard, we'll talk about horsetails next, but these horsetails, equisenum, they'll come up in your yard, and the reason they're a pest is because they're very hard on lawnmower blades. And they're hard on lawnmower blades because they have these silica deposits inside of them, and these silica deposits will dull your blades, and they're what give horsetails their texture. Okay, there are 15 species that are cosmopolitan from Oceania to Antarctica, and they have these silica deposits. And actually, scouring rush is a nickname for them, and they were used by indigenous people all over for cleaning and scrubbing and sanding things off, because they actually can be very abrasive. And I've used them to clean a cast iron or something like that in a river on a camping trip. They're pretty useful. And then they're also present in gold prospecting because they were thought to associate traditionally with gold. And while they don't associate directly with gold, they are arsenic tolerant and actually arsenic accumulators. And there has been some research done into correlating the amount of arsenic accumulated in some of the local horsetails, and then analyzing the associations with gold in the area, because arsenic and gold are kind of they're found together. So yeah, here's an example of their life cycle. Okay, we've got a strugulus, a little cone-shaped thing with sporangiophores and sporangium, and those spores undergo meiosis. Spore mother cells rather undergo meiosis, and then we've got these spores that'll grow again to an antheridium, an archegonium on a structure, and these it's held in with a rhizoid. Excuse me. And those again are going to contain an egg and a sperm that fertilizes into zygotes that grow to gametophytes, and then these are sporophytes, the actual vegetative shoot that you see there. Again, on this one, you can follow your ploidy from sporophyte to gametophyte generation. Okay, and finally, we're at leptosporangiate ferns, or true ferns, and this is your fiddlehead ferns and many of your ornamental ferns, okay? And these are gonna have those large, complex leaves, and they're gonna be varied, like corkscrew rush, or I don't see a bird's nest fern in here, Boston fern. There's a lot of your traditional horticultural ferns come here. A large economic impact. And the other thing is, these ferns particularly people have used as medicine and as food and as feed for animals and with spiritual purpose for as long as humans have interacted with them. Okay, and they're found worldwide. They're found in deserts. They're found in the Uinta Mountains and everywhere in between. So one thing here, you see these fiddlehead ferns, and fiddlehead ferns as a culinary object, as a vegetable, refers to a variety of species, but it's typically how these are collected. They're not cultivated. They are a foraged product, and so people will go out and stomp through the woods and they'll collect these, and then they'll go sell them to a restaurant for $30 a pound or more. And the thing about that is, yes, they're pretty delicious, but I think that something that's important to understand is that entire populations of these are being destroyed by foragers, and the local ecologies are being disrupted, and it's overall a very negative thing. The foraging industry, and particularly in some large markets like California, there are spots and there are places where certain fungi and certain ferns and other products are being poached at alarming rates and really disrupting those populations, and also the other plants and animals in those areas that rely on these. Another example is ginseng in the Appalachia in the south that's heavily poached and is extremely valuable, and it's bad, and that's my opinion. Okay, finally, let's just look at this life cycle here, and then we'll wrap up. So if we start again at a spore being dispersed, okay, we have a spore that's germinating, forming a young gametophyte that is in. This turns into a mature gametophyte. On that structure, you'll find an antherid and archegonium. And the sperm and the egg will come together and fertilize, forming a zygote with this gametophyte then sprouting a sporophyte. And this mature sporophyte is where we've got our little fiddleheads and the typical leaves of a fern, typical example. And on those we'll have the sorus that have sporangium in them, and those sporangium will the cells inside will undergo meiosis so that they're they're haploid again, and then those haploid spores are dispersed, and that starts our process over again. And that's the lecture this week on ferns and horsetails.